The front door opened, and the man standing there was the same man who walked out of my life 7 years ago. For a second, my brain refused to catch up with what my eyes were seeing, because according to the contract folded inside my purse, this man was about to become my new boss. Owen stared at me like he'd just seen someone who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. What neither of us knew in that moment was that the little girl waiting at daycare had his eyes, and the past we both thought was finished was about to walk right back into the room. Welcome to the Mr. Graham family, where love, betrayal, secrets, and life-changing truths unfold in every story. If you believe every story has a lesson, a message, and a moment that stays with you forever, then you're in the right place. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and hit subscribe to officially become part of the Mr. Graham family. If this opening pulled you in, go ahead and tap the like button. It helps a story reach more people who enjoy real emotional storytelling like this. Now, let's step into today's unforgettable story. Most mornings in Atlanta began before the sun fully committed to the day. Demetria's alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., a quiet but stubborn sound that always pulled her out of sleep whether she liked it or not. For a moment she lay still, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment bedroom. The world outside the window was barely awake. Cars passed occasionally. Somewhere down the street a bus groaned to life. The city stretched slowly, like a person rolling their shoulders after a long night. But Demetria had been awake long before Atlanta decided to move. She swung her legs out of bed and stepped onto the cool wooden floor. The apartment wasn't fancy, but it was hers, and most importantly, it was home for 2 people. Before doing anything else, Demetria glanced down the hallway toward the small bedroom across from hers. The door was slightly open. Inside, soft breathing filled the room. Kiara, 3 years old, curly hair that had a personality of its own, a little girl who somehow managed to kick her blanket halfway across the bed every single night. Demetria leaned against the doorframe for a moment, just watching her daughter sleep. There was something peaceful about that quiet moment. No responsibilities yet, no rushing, no noise, just the calm rhythm of a child who trusted the world enough to sleep deeply in it. Demetria pulled the blanket back over Kiara's shoulder gently. 5 more minutes, she whispered to herself. Then she walked toward the kitchen. Coffee came first. Always. The smell filled the apartment quickly, warm and familiar. She inhaled deeply while leaning against the counter, letting the caffeine slowly wake up her brain. The kitchen wasn't large, but it carried personality. Wooden spoons resting inside a ceramic jar. A spice rack that had expanded far beyond its original space, covering most of one wall. Handwritten recipes taped inside cabinet doors where only she could see them. Cooking had never been just a job for Demetria. It was something deeper, a language she had learned long before adulthood. Some people expressed love with words. Others bought gifts. Demetria cooked. Her grandmother used to say something that stuck with her even now. "Baby, people can lie with their mouths, but their stomach always tells the truth." Demetria smiled slightly at the memory while whisking pancake batter inside a bowl. Her childhood had been loud in the best way. A tight black neighborhood where everybody knew everybody. Sunday dinners were not optional events. They were gatherings. Uncles arguing over football games. Cousins racing through the house like tiny hurricanes. Old soul music humming through the living room speakers. And always, food. Fried chicken with a crisp crack when you bit into it. Mac and cheese so creamy people forgot their table manners. Sweet tea poured into tall glasses sweating in the summer heat. Demetria learned to cook right in the center of all that noise. Her grandmother standing beside her. "More butter," she would say. Demetria would ask, "How much?" Her grandmother would shrug. "Enough." Years later, culinary school gave her technique. But her real education happened in that kitchen. The batter sizzled the moment it touched the hot pan. The sound pulled Demetria back to the present. Right on cue, small footsteps padded down the hallway. Kiara appeared at the kitchen entrance wearing pajamas covered in tiny stars. Her curls pointed in every direction like they had been arguing with the pillow all night. "Mama." Demetria flipped a pancake. "Morning, sleepyhead." Kiara rubbed her eyes and climbed onto the chair near the kitchen counter like she had done it 1,000 times before. "You making pancakes?" Demetria raised an eyebrow without turning around. "What does it look like?" Kiara leaned forward dramatically. "Chocolate chip?" Demetria laughed. "You start negotiating early." Kiara grinned proudly. Demetria sprinkled a few chocolate chips onto one of the pancakes anyway. Kiara gasped like she had just witnessed magic. Those little moments mattered more than most people realized. Life had not unfolded exactly the way Demetria once imagined. But standing there in that kitchen, flipping pancakes while her daughter swung her legs from the chair, she felt something close to peace. Kiara rested her chin on the counter. "Mama." "Yes, baby? You cooking for people again today?" Demetria nodded. "Always." Kiara considered that carefully. "You make them pancakes too?" Demetria placed a pancake on her daughter's plate. "Not the chocolate chip kind." Kiara shook her head with serious disappointment. "They missing out?" Demetria laughed softly. But as she poured another round of batter into the pan, a memory slipped quietly into her thoughts. A tall man sitting at a restaurant table years ago. Calm eyes, watching her food like it held secrets. Owen. The memory passed quickly like a cloud drifting across the sun. Demetria focused on the stove again. Some memories stayed in the past for a reason, and she had built a life that didn't need to look back. 7 years earlier, Demetria's mornings looked very different. Back then, her life ran on restaurant hours instead of school schedules. Late nights, early prep shifts, the constant rhythm of knives hitting cutting boards and pans clanging against stovetops. The restaurant where she worked sat in the heart of downtown Atlanta, tucked between glass office towers and busy sidewalks. From the outside it looked quiet and elegant, the kind of place where the lighting stayed low and the prices made people pause before ordering. Inside the kitchen, though, elegance had nothing to do with it. The kitchen moved like controlled chaos. Orders printed nonstop. Servers rushed in and out carrying plates. Chefs barked instructions over the noise of sizzling oil. Demetria stood at the plating station that night, focused on finishing dishes as they came off the stove. Her white chef jacket already carried small stains from the evening rush, and a loose curl had escaped the scarf wrapped around her hair. She didn't mind the pace. Cooking under pressure always sharpened her focus. "Table 12 needs their entree now," someone called from the line. Demetria reached for the plate in front of her and adjusted the garnish carefully. Presentation mattered just as much as flavor in places like this, especially with the type of customers who filled the dining room. Executives closing deals, business partners celebrating contracts, wealthy guests who expected every detail to feel perfect. Demetria placed the finished plate on the service counter. A server grabbed it quickly and disappeared through the swinging kitchen doors. 10 minutes later, the same server rushed back in looking flustered. "I messed up," she said breathlessly. Demetria looked up. "What happened?" "The orders got mixed. Table 12 got the wrong plate. Mistakes happened. Usually the solution was simple. Remake the dish and send the correct one." But before anyone could react, the manager stepped into the kitchen doorway. "Demetria," he said. She wiped her hands on a towel. "Yeah?" "Customer at table 12 wants to speak with the chef." Her stomach dropped slightly. That usually meant trouble. Maybe the food arrived cold. Maybe the seasoning wasn't right. Maybe someone simply wanted to complain. Restaurant kitchens lived under constant pressure from customer opinions. Demetria removed her apron and stepped toward the dining room. The noise of the kitchen faded behind her as she pushed through the swinging doors. The restaurant dining area carried an entirely different energy. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Low lighting created quiet shadows across the tables. People spoke in calm voices, the opposite of the organized chaos in the kitchen. The manager guided her toward a table near the window. 4 people sat there. 3 of them were engaged in conversation. The 4th man looked up the moment she approached. That was Owen. Even before she knew his name, something about him stood out. He wasn't flashy, no loud jewelry, no dramatic personality trying to dominate the table. He sat calmly, one hand resting near the plate in front of him, observing. When the manager gestured toward Demetria, the man straightened slightly. "This is the chef responsible for your dish," the manager said. Demetria braced herself, but the man didn't look upset. Instead, he studied her for a moment with quiet curiosity. "Did you cook this?" he asked. Demetria nodded carefully. "Yes." He looked down at the plate again. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair. "This is the best thing I've eaten in months." Demetria blinked. That was not the reaction she expected. The manager looked relieved. "Well, we're glad you enjoyed it." But Owen continued looking at Demetria. "What's in the sauce?" he asked. Demetria relaxed slightly. Roasted garlic, butter, white wine reduction, and thyme. Owen nodded slowly, like someone analyzing a puzzle. It's balanced. Demetria shrugged. I try. The three other guests at the table had stopped talking now, clearly entertained by the conversation. One of them chuckled. You interrogating the chef now? Owen ignored the comment. Instead, he looked back at Demetria. Most places overcomplicate dishes like this, he said. Too many ingredients trying to prove something. Demetria folded her arms lightly. Good food doesn't need to prove anything. For the first time, Owen smiled. A small, genuine smile. That might be the smartest thing I've heard tonight. The manager glanced between them awkwardly. Well, if everything is good here, we'll let you enjoy your meal. But Owen spoke again before Demetria could leave. Do you mind if I ask one more question? She tilted her head. Depends what it is. Do you ever leave the kitchen? Demetria frowned slightly. What does that mean? Owen said calmly. Do you ever sit down and eat the food you cook? Demetria thought about that for a moment. Not often. Restaurant life rarely allowed that kind of pause. No, she admitted. Owen nodded. That's unfortunate. Why? Because if you tasted your own food tonight, he said, you'd understand why I asked to meet you. Something in the way he said it felt sincere, not flirtatious, not arrogant, just honest. Demetria found herself smiling despite the long shift behind her. Well, she said, I'm glad the mistake worked out. Owen raised an eyebrow. Mistake? The wrong order. He glanced down at the plate again. Then he shook his head slowly. Sometimes the wrong plate is exactly the right one. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. And in that quiet pause, something small but meaningful settled into the space between them. Not fireworks, not instant romance, just curiosity, the kind that quietly pulls two strangers into a conversation that lasts longer than expected. Demetria didn't know it yet, but that small moment beside a restaurant table would change the direction of her life in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. And the man sitting there with calm eyes and thoughtful questions would soon become far more than just a customer. After that first conversation at the restaurant, Demetria assumed she would never see Owen again. That was usually how those moments worked. Customers complimented a dish, maybe exchanged a few polite words, and then disappeared back into their own lives. But Owen came back. 3 nights later, Demetria noticed him sitting at the same table near the window. He wasn't with a group this time. Just one man, one menu, and that same calm way of observing the room. When the server returned to the kitchen, she smirked. Your fan is back. Demetria rolled her eyes. He's not my fan. Uh-huh. The server leaned closer. He asked if you were working tonight. Demetria tried not to react, but the small smile creeping onto her face betrayed her. Later that evening, when the rush slowed down, the manager waved her toward the dining room again. Your customer requested the chef. Demetria stepped out of the kitchen and walked toward Owen's table. This time she wasn't nervous, just curious. You making a habit out of this? She asked. Owen looked up from his plate. Maybe. Demetria crossed her arms lightly. You know this is a restaurant, not a Meet the Chef club. That's disappointing. Why? Because the chef seems more interesting than the menu. Demetria laughed quietly. You say that to every person cooking your food? No, Owen replied calmly, just the ones who deserve it. That was how it started, not with dramatic declarations or intense romance, just conversations. At first it was quick chats when Demetria stepped out of the kitchen during slow moments. Then it became something else. Owen started showing up after her shift ended. They would walk down quiet Atlanta streets while the city settled into the night. Sometimes they stopped for coffee. Other nights they simply talked while leaning against the railing of a parking deck overlooking the glowing skyline. Their worlds were different in almost every way. Demetria came from a close black community where neighbors knew each other's families, stories, and struggles. Owen had grown up in a wealthy white suburb where privacy mattered more than connection. Demetria's childhood dinners were loud, crowded, and full of laughter. Owen's family meals were quiet and carefully structured, but somehow those differences didn't divide them. They balanced each other. Demetria liked that Owen actually listened. He never interrupted her stories or tried to correct her opinions. He absorbed what she said like it mattered. Owen liked that Demetria didn't treat him differently after learning he was wealthy. She didn't seem impressed by his money. If anything, she challenged him more than anyone else in his life. "You work too much," she told him once while they sat on a park bench eating takeout. Owen shrugged. "That's how companies grow, and that's how people forget how to live." He studied her for a moment. "You always this direct?" "Only when someone needs to hear the truth." Owen smiled. "That explains a lot." Over time, their connection deepened. Dinners turned into weekends together. Conversations stretched into early mornings. The kind of relationship where comfort grew naturally without either person forcing it. For 2 years, Demetria believed they were building something real. And maybe they were, but life rarely moves in straight lines. Owen's business began expanding quickly. New investors, new markets, constant travel. The calm confidence Demetria admired slowly turned into something heavier. Pressure, phone calls late at night, meetings that stretched across entire days. One evening, Demetrius sat across from him at dinner while he checked his phone for the 4th time in 10 minutes. "You're not even here," she said. Owen looked up. "I'm here." "No, you're physically present," she replied. "Your mind is somewhere else." He sighed and set the phone down. "You know this expansion is important." "I know," she said. "But lately it feels like everything else comes second." Owen rubbed his forehead. "You're asking me to slow down when everything is moving faster. I'm asking you to show up." The conversation didn't explode into shouting. That wasn't their style. Instead, tension quietly settled between them. Small disagreements began appearing more often. Missed dinners, canceled plans, long silences where conversation used to live. Then one evening, Owen showed up at her apartment, looking exhausted. "I need space for a while," he said. Demetrius stared at him. "Space? My life is chaos right now," he admitted. "If I don't focus completely, everything could collapse." She waited for him to say something else. Something reassuring, something that sounded like love. But nothing came. Just silence. So Demetria nodded slowly. "If that's what you need." Owen hesitated like he wanted to say more. But instead, he left. No dramatic argument. No slammed doors. Just absence. For weeks, Demetria told herself it was temporary, that Owen would come back once his world calmed down. But the calls never came. The visits never happened. Eventually, she stopped expecting them. Life moved forward whether her heart was ready or not. 3 months later, Demetria sat in a doctor's office staring at a test result that changed everything. Pregnant. Her first thought wasn't fear. It was disbelief. Her second thought was Owen. She held her phone in her hand that night for nearly an hour. His number still saved, still familiar. But every time she considered calling him, the same memory returned. The night he asked for space, the silence that followed. Finally, she placed the phone on the table. Demetria made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. If someone walks away from you, you don't chase them. So she didn't. Instead, she prepared for the future, a future that soon arrived in the form of a tiny baby girl with stubborn curls and curious eyes. Kiara. Demetria raised her with love, determination, and more strength than she ever knew she possessed. And for 3 years, the past stayed exactly where she believed it belonged. Behind her. Until the day a phone call from her agent offered a private chef job at a mansion in Atlanta. A job she accepted without realizing one important detail. The man who lived in that house was Owen. The next morning began like most mornings in Demetria's life. Busy. After dropping Kiara off at daycare, she headed straight to a small kitchen she rented for private cooking preparations. The space wasn't glamorous, but it worked perfectly for what she needed. Shelves lined with ingredients, neatly labeled containers, 2 wide prep tables that had seen countless meals come together. Demetria tied her apron around her waist and began sorting fresh vegetables across the cutting board. Carrots, bell peppers, green onions. The quiet rhythm of chopping usually helped clear her mind. Private chef work had become her specialty over the past few years. Instead of cooking inside crowded restaurants, she now prepared meals for families who wanted something more personal. Some clients hired her for special dinners. Others wanted weekly meal plans prepared in their homes. It paid well enough to keep her life stable. More importantly, it allowed her to control her schedule around Kiara. The knife moved steadily through a bundle of herbs when her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen. Her agent. Demetria wiped her hands on a towel and answered. "Morning," she said. The voice on the other end sounded cheerful. I've got something that might interest you. Demetria leaned against the counter. What kind of job? Private chef position. That's most of my jobs. This one is different, the agent replied. Full-time. Demetria frowned slightly. She usually avoided full-time private chef positions. They came with long hours and unpredictable schedules, not ideal when you had a 3-year-old waiting at daycare every afternoon. I don't usually take full-time work, she said. I know, the agent replied. But listen to the details first. Demetria waited. Wealthy client, the agent continued, recently moved to Atlanta. Demetria had heard that description before. Atlanta attracted wealthy newcomers every year. Business executives, tech investors, athletes. What's the schedule like? Demetria asked. Regular weekday meals, occasional gatherings. That part sounded manageable, but Demetria still hesitated. I like flexibility, she said. You know that... There was a small pause. Then the agent added something else. The pay is significant. Demetria stopped moving. How significant? The number that followed made her raise an eyebrow. That salary could cover daycare costs, rent, groceries, savings, all without her constantly juggling multiple clients. Demetria leaned back against the counter slowly. That's generous. I told you, the agent said. This one might be worth considering. Who's the client? Tech investor. That explained the salary. The technology world produced millionaires faster than almost any other industry. Where's the house? Demetria asked. Her phone buzzed again as the address arrived. She glanced down. North Atlanta. Quiet neighborhood. Large properties spaced far apart. The kind of area where houses didn't just sit next to each other. They had space to breathe. Demetria slipped the phone into her pocket. Interview? Yes, the agent replied. Today, if possible. Demetria checked the clock. Still early enough. All right, she said finally. I'll go take a look. After ending the call, she stood there for a moment considering the opportunity. Full-time work meant stability, but it also meant stepping deeper into someone else's world. Still, opportunities like this didn't appear often. Demetria finished prepping the food she had started, cleaned the kitchen space, and headed toward the parking lot. Atlanta traffic had already begun building by the time she reached the highway. Cars moved steadily between glass office buildings and rows of restaurants preparing for lunch service. As she drove north, the scenery slowly changed. Busy streets gave way to quiet neighborhoods. Tall trees, long driveways, large homes set back from the road. Eventually, her phone navigation announced the final turn. Demetria followed the instructions and pulled onto a wide street lined with massive houses. Each one looked like it belonged in a luxury magazine. She slowed her car as the address numbers appeared on mailboxes. Then she saw it. The house stood behind a tall iron gate. Large, modern, not flashy, just confident in its size and design. Demetria parked along the curb and stepped out of the car. For a moment she simply stood there, studying the place. Working here would mean stepping into a very different world from the one she had built for herself and Kiara. But sometimes life required bold decisions. She grabbed her bag, walked up the driveway, and climbed the wide stone steps leading to the front door. Demetria took one breath. Then she knocked. She had no idea that the person about to open that door was someone she had already known. Once upon a time, Demetria stood on the front porch with her bag resting against her hip. For a moment she adjusted the strap on her shoulder and glanced around the quiet neighborhood again. The air felt calmer on this side of Atlanta. No honking traffic, no crowded sidewalks. Just wide streets, tall trees and houses, built far enough apart that neighbors could live entire lives without accidentally hearing each other's conversations. The house in front of her looked even larger up close. Dark wood door, wide glass windows, clean stone steps leading down to a driveway that could probably hold 6 cars. Whoever lived here clearly had money, but the place didn't feel loud about it. Some homes screamed wealth. This one didn't need to. Demetria lifted her hand and knocked. The sound echoed gently against the solid door. She stepped back slightly and waited. For a few seconds nothing happened. Then she heard footsteps inside the house. Calm, steady footsteps moving toward the door. Demetria straightened automatically. Professional mode. She had done plenty of private chef interviews over the years. Usually the homeowner opened the door with polite curiosity, asked a few questions, and invited her inside to discuss food preferences. Nothing complicated, just business. The lock clicked. The door opened, and for a brief moment the world seemed to pause, because the man standing in front of her was someone she knew very well. Owen. 7 years had passed, but there was no mistaking him. His hair was slightly shorter now. The lines around his eyes were more defined, but the calm presence she remembered remained exactly the same. Owen stared at her the same way she stared at him, like both of their brains needed a second to catch up with what their eyes were seeing. Demetria? Her name came out slowly, almost like he wasn't sure it was real. Demetria swallowed. Of all the houses in Atlanta, of all the possible clients her agent could have sent her to, it had to be his. "Hi, Owen." The silence that followed carried the weight of 7 years. Neither of them moved. Neither of them seemed entirely sure what to say next. Finally, Owen stepped aside slightly, still looking at her with quiet disbelief. "You're the chef?" Demetria nodded. "Looks like it." Owen ran a hand through his hair slowly. "Well, I didn't expect that." "Me neither." Another brief pause settled between them. The air felt strange now, not hostile, just complicated. Owen finally gestured toward the inside of the house. "You should probably come in." Demetria hesitated for half a second. Then she stepped across the doorway. The house felt even bigger from the inside. High ceilings, wide open living space, bookshelves lining one wall instead of televisions, large windows letting sunlight spill across the polished floor. Owen closed the door behind her. The quiet inside the house made the moment feel even more awkward. Demetria adjusted the strap on her bag again. "So," she said carefully, "you moved to Atlanta?" Owen nodded. "About 6 months ago." 6 months. Demetria processed that quietly. They had been living in the same city for half a year without knowing. Atlanta suddenly felt a lot smaller. Owen leaned lightly against the wall near the hallway. "My agent told me she found one of the best private chefs in the city." Demetria raised an eyebrow. "And you didn't bother asking the name?" "They sent a resume." "And you didn't read it?" Owen gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I skimmed." Demetria couldn't help laughing softly. "Millionaire habits. That obvious?" "Yes." For a moment, the tension eased slightly. The familiar rhythm of their old conversation slipped into the room, but it didn't last long, because the past still existed between them. Unanswered questions, unfinished feelings. Owen crossed his arms thoughtfully. "So you're working as a private chef now?" "Mostly." "You left the restaurant world?" Demetria nodded. "Schedules are easier." Owen studied her face carefully. Something thoughtful passed through his expression. "Life change?" Demetria didn't answer immediately. She simply looked around the large living space again. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Finally, she turned back toward him. "You said you needed a chef." Owen understood the message immediately. Business, not history. He nodded slowly. "Right." He gestured toward a hallway. "The kitchen's this way." Demetria followed him. The hallway opened into a massive kitchen that looked like it belonged in a professional cooking show. Double ovens, wide marble counters, industrial refrigerator, more cabinet space than most restaurants had. But something about it looked untouched, too perfect, too clean. Demetria stepped inside and placed her bag on the counter. "You don't cook much," she said. Owen leaned against the doorway. "That obvious?" "No spices on the counter," she replied. "No oil stains near the stove." He looked around like he was seeing the room for the first time. "I mostly order takeout." Demetria nodded. "That explains it." Owen watched her quietly as she examined the kitchen equipment. Professional, again. Focused, the same way she used to move around restaurant kitchens years ago. Except now she carried a different kind of confidence. Finally, she turned back toward him. "So," she said calmly, "what exactly are you looking for in a private chef?" Owen met her eyes, and just like that, the interview began. But beneath the professional conversation waiting to happen, something deeper lingered. 7 years of unfinished history sitting quietly between them. Demetria stood in the center of the kitchen for a moment, taking in the space around her. The equipment alone told a story. Professional-grade stove, 2 large ovens, a refrigerator big enough to hold ingredients for a small catering event. But the countertops looked almost untouched, clean, empty. a kitchen that had been designed for cooking but rarely used for it. Demetria reached out and opened one of the cabinets. Inside sat a few plates and glasses. Another cabinet held neatly stacked cookware that looked barely used. She glanced back at Owen. "You weren't kidding about the takeout." Owen leaned against the doorway with his arms crossed. "I warned you." Demetria closed the cabinet. "Well, at least the kitchen has potential." Owen smiled slightly. "That's what the designer said too." Demetria walked toward the stove, checking the burners out of habit. Her movements were automatic now. Years of working in kitchens had trained her to read a cooking space within minutes. Finally, she turned back toward him. "So," she said calmly, "tell me what you need." Owen straightened. "Regular meals during the week," he said. "Breakfast sometimes. Dinner most nights. Diet restrictions? None. Allergies? No. Favorite foods?" Owen thought about it. "Honestly, anything that isn't takeout." Demetria nodded. "That can be arranged." She pulled out a small notebook from her bag and placed it on the counter. "What about gatherings?" she asked. "Occasional," Owen replied. "Business dinners. Maybe a few small social events." "How many people?" "Usually fewer than 10. Demetria wrote a few notes. Everything he described sounded manageable. Still, one important issue remained. She set the pen down and looked directly at him. "You realize this situation is unusual." Owen let out a quiet breath. "That's one word for it. 7 years. That much time had passed since they last stood in the same room. Yet somehow the familiarity still existed. The way he leaned against the counter. The way he watched her when she spoke. But the comfort that once lived between them had been replaced by caution. Demetria crossed her arms lightly. "Let me ask you something," she said. Owen nodded. "Go ahead. Why didn't you ever call?" The question landed quietly in the room. Owen didn't look surprised, almost like he had been expecting it. "I thought you didn't want to hear from me." Demetria stared at him. "You disappeared. I thought I was giving you space. You vanished." Owen rubbed the back of his neck slowly. "I handled that situation badly." Demetria studied him carefully. That was the closest thing to an apology she had ever heard from him. But apologies years later rarely fixed anything. She looked away toward the kitchen windows. Outside, the trees moved gently in the afternoon breeze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Demetria turned back. "This is probably a bad idea," she said quietly. Owen didn't argue. He simply nodded. "You might be right." That response surprised her. "You're not going to try convincing me to stay?" "I don't think convincing you has ever worked," Owen replied calmly. A small smile slipped across Demetria's face despite herself. That part was true. Her grandmother used to say she had the stubbornness of a storm. Beautiful, but impossible to redirect once it started moving. Demetria picked up her bag from the counter. For a second she considered walking out the door, starting fresh somewhere else, avoiding old history. But then practical reality stepped into the conversation. Rent, daycare, savings. Raising a child alone meant every financial decision mattered. Private chef jobs for wealthy clients often paid extremely well. She glanced back at Owen. "Salary?" she asked. Owen named the number. Demetria blinked once. That was more than generous. It was life-changing. Enough to give her stability. Enough to give Kiara opportunities she might not otherwise afford. Owen noticed the look on her face. "Too low?" he asked. Demetria laughed once. "Are you serious? I'm trying to hire the best." The kitchen grew quiet again. Demetria weighed the situation carefully. Working here meant reopening a chapter of her life she had closed long ago. But sometimes life pushed people into uncomfortable places for a reason. Finally, she placed her bag back on the counter. 1 month, she said. Owen straightened. "A trial?" "Exactly." He nodded immediately. "That works." Demetria held up one finger. "One rule." Owen waited. "Work stays work." He understood the boundary instantly. "No personal drama," she added. "Agreed." Demetria studied him for a moment longer. 7 years earlier, this man had walked out of her life without warning. Now somehow he was standing in front of her offering a job that could reshape her future. Life had a strange sense of timing. She closed her notebook. "I'll start tomorrow," she said. Owen nodded slowly. "Good. As Demetria walked toward the front door, she paused briefly in the hallway. Neither of them realized yet that the biggest surprise waiting in this story had nothing to do with their past relationship, because somewhere across the city, a 3-year-old girl with bright curls and curious eyes was finishing her afternoon at daycare. A little girl named Kiara. A little girl who carried Owen's eyes. And sooner or later, those two worlds were going to collide. Demetria arrived early the next morning. The sun had barely climbed above the trees when she pulled into Owen's driveway with several grocery bags in the back seat of her car. The house looked different in daylight, less mysterious. Still large, still quiet, but now the wide windows reflected the morning sky. She carried the groceries inside through the front door Owen had unlocked for her earlier that morning. He had already left for a meeting, which suited Demetria just fine. Starting the job without an audience felt easier. The kitchen greeted her with the same spotless silence she noticed the day before. Counters empty, cabinets neat, no scent of food lingering in the air. For a moment she stood in the center of the room. Then she rolled up the sleeves of her chef jacket. Time to change that. Demetria unpacked the groceries slowly. Fresh herbs first, basil, rosemary, thyme. She rinsed them and placed them in small glass containers near the window. Then came vegetables, bell peppers, sweet onions, carrots, garlic. The refrigerator slowly filled with color. She organized spices across a small section of the counter. Salt, black pepper, paprika, cayenne. Within an hour, the kitchen began to look less like a showroom and more like a place where real cooking happened. The transformation continued as she started preparing ingredients. The soft rhythm of chopping vegetables filled the room. Garlic hitting hot olive oil sent a warm scent drifting through the house. Butter melted slowly inside a skillet. Demetria moved through the space naturally, like she had cooked here for years. By the time Owen returned home later that evening, the house felt different. The moment he stepped through the front door, he noticed it. The smell. Garlic, fresh herbs, something roasting in the oven. He paused in the hallway, listening. The quiet house now carried life. Footsteps led him toward the kitchen. When he stepped inside, he saw Demetria standing at the stove. Her hair tied back, one hand stirring a pan while the other reached for seasoning. The scene felt strangely familiar. For a moment, Owen simply watched. 7 years had passed, but the sight of Demetria cooking still pulled his attention the same way it used to. She turned when she heard him. "You're early," she said. Meeting ended faster than expected. He glanced around the kitchen. The counters now held ingredients. A cutting board, bowls with chopped vegetables. The refrigerator hummed softly behind them, full of food instead of empty space. "You changed the entire room," he said. Demetria shrugged lightly. A kitchen shouldn't feel like a museum. Owen walked closer to the counter. "What are you making?" "Dinner. I figured that." She gave him a quick look. Herb roasted chicken, garlic potatoes, grilled vegetables. Owen leaned against the counter. "That smells incredible." Demetria continued, stirring the pan calmly. Food usually does when someone actually cooks it. He laughed quietly. "I deserved that." The conversation slipped into a comfortable rhythm. Not intimate, but not tense either. Just two people talking while dinner cooked. Soon Demetria began plating the meal. Chicken rested neatly beside golden potatoes. Vegetables arranged carefully along the edge. She set the plate on the dining table. "Try it," she said. Owen sat down and picked up his fork. The first bite stopped him. He leaned back slowly in the chair. For a second he didn't speak. Demetria watched his reaction from the kitchen counter. "Well?" she asked. Owen set the fork down gently. "I missed this." Demetria wiped her hands on a towel. "My cooking?" Owen looked at her. There was a quiet sincerity in his eyes. But when he answered, his voice stayed casual. "Your cooking," he said. Demetria nodded and turned back toward the stove. She didn't notice the small pause that followed, because Owen hadn't meant just the food. He meant the warmth filling the house, the sound of someone moving through the kitchen, the quiet comfort that existed when Demetria was around. Things his life had been missing for a long time. But some truths take time before they are spoken out loud. For now, dinner continued quietly, professional, respectful, yet somewhere beneath the surface, old emotions had begun stirring again. By the time Demetria finished cleaning Owen's kitchen that evening, the sun had already started dropping behind the trees. The house grew quiet again. Owen had retreated to his office with a plate of food, and the sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway. Demetria wiped the counters one last time and checked the refrigerator to make sure everything was organized for the next day. Chicken marinating for tomorrow's dinner, vegetables stored neatly in containers, fresh herbs resting in small jars, everything in its place. She untied her apron and folded it carefully into her bag. Her workday in this large, silent house was finished. Now the rest of her life was waiting. Demetria stepped outside and drove across the city toward the daycare. Atlanta traffic had slowed a little by the time she arrived, but the street still carried that familiar evening energy. Cars moving home from work, people rushing through grocery stores, families beginning the quiet rhythm of nighttime routines. When Demetria pushed open the daycare door, a small voice shouted instantly, "Mama!" Kiara came running across the room like a tiny hurricane. Her curly hair bounced wildly as she wrapped her arms around Demetria's legs. Demetria bent down and lifted her daughter into a hug. "How was your day?" she asked. Kiara rested her chin on her mother's shoulder. "I drawed a dinosaur." "You did? It purple?" Demetria smiled. "That sounds very artistic." Kiara nodded proudly. They stepped outside together into the warm Atlanta evening. Kiara held Demetria's hand while skipping along the sidewalk toward the car. "Mama," she said suddenly. "Yes, baby. You cooking today?" Demetria opened the car door. "I cook every day." Kiara climbed into the seat. "But you cooking here or cooking there?" Demetria paused for a moment while buckling her daughter in. "Both." Kiara considered that carefully. "You cook for the man again?" Demetria started the car. "Yes." Kiara leaned forward curiously. "He nice?" Demetria hesitated for half a second. Then she answered honestly, "He seems nice." Kiara nodded like she had reached a very serious conclusion. "Good." The drive home took about 20 minutes. By the time they reached their apartment building, the sky had turned a soft shade of evening blue. Demetria carried Kiara inside while balancing a grocery bag on her arm. Their apartment felt completely different from Owen's house. Smaller, louder, alive. A colorful drawing taped to the refrigerator. Toys scattered across the living room floor. Cartoons playing softly on the television. Kiara kicked off her shoes and ran straight toward the kitchen. "Mama cooking again," she announced dramatically. Demetria laughed while setting groceries on the counter. "Relax, little supervisor." Kiara dragged a chair across the floor and climbed onto it beside the counter. Helping in the kitchen had become one of her favorite activities. Helping, in Kiara's world, mostly meant stirring things that didn't need stirring. Demetria began chopping vegetables for their dinner. Simple food tonight. Pasta, fresh tomato sauce, garlic bread. Kiara watched closely. "Mama," she asked, "the man you cook for, he got big house?" Demetria nodded. "Very big." Kiara's eyes widened. "Bigger than this house?" Demetria laughed. "Yes, baby. Much bigger." Kiara thought about that while swinging her legs from the chair. "Why he need you cook? Because he doesn't know how—" Kiara gasped. "Everybody know how cook." Demetria smiled. "Not everybody." Kiara pointed toward the stove proudly. "I know." "Yes, you do." The apartment slowly filled with the smell of garlic and tomatoes. Music played softly from Demetria's phone on the counter. Kiara hummed along while stirring a bowl of shredded cheese. Moments like this reminded Demetria why she worked so hard. Life wasn't perfect, but it was full. Across the city, Owen's house remained quiet. Dinner had long been finished, yet he still sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty plate in front of him. Not because he was hungry, but because something about the evening felt different. For years he had eaten most meals alone. Quick takeout dinners between meetings. Food that filled time more than it filled a room. Tonight had felt different. The house smelled like a real kitchen again. Someone moved through the space with confidence. Someone who understood how to bring life into a room just by cooking. Owen leaned back in the chair slowly. He told himself the feeling meant nothing. Demetria was simply doing her job. Professional, efficient, exactly what he hired her for. Yet the quiet house now felt strangely empty without her in it. And Owen realized something he hadn't expected. He was already looking forward to tomorrow's dinner, not just for the food, but for the presence of the person cooking it. Two lives moving through the same city, two very different worlds. One quiet mansion filled with wealth and silence. One small apartment filled with laughter and cartoons. Neither Owen nor Demetria realized yet how closely those worlds were about to collide. Because soon, a simple dinner invitation would change everything. 2 weeks passed faster than Demetria expected. The routine settled into place naturally. She arrived at Owen's house in the mornings with grocery bags and a plan for the day's meals. The kitchen that once looked unused now carried the rhythm of real cooking. Fresh ingredients filled the refrigerator. Her spice jars stayed lined up along the counter. By the end of the first week, the house had developed a new scent that seemed to linger in the air long after she finished cooking. Garlic, butter, roasting herbs. The quiet mansion had begun to feel less like a display piece and more like a home. Demetria moved through the kitchen confidently now, no longer studying the layout like a stranger. She knew exactly where the knives were, which burner heated fastest, which cabinet held the mixing bowls. It was becoming familiar, comfortable. That comfort was something she tried not to think about too much, because the man who owned the house still complicated everything. Owen remained respectful of the boundaries she had set. Work stayed work. He didn't ask personal questions. He didn't bring up the past. Most days their conversations stayed focused on meals, schedules, and grocery lists. But sometimes there were moments, small ones, moments when their eyes met across the kitchen, and something unspoken lingered between them. Moments when the silence carried memories neither of them mentioned. On a Thursday evening, Demetria stood at the counter slicing roasted vegetables while dinner finished in the oven. Owen walked into the kitchen with a glass of water in his hand. "Smells good in here again," he said. Demetria didn't look up. That tends to happen when someone cooks. He leaned against the counter watching her work. "You've changed the entire house. I changed the kitchen. The kitchen changes the house." Demetria considered that while sliding vegetables into a bowl. Maybe. Owen stayed there a moment longer than usual. Then he cleared his throat slightly. "I need to ask you something." Demetria glanced at him briefly. "That sounds serious." "Not serious," he said. "Just a request." She set the knife down. "All right." Owen rested his hands on the counter. "I'm hosting a dinner this weekend." "Business?" Demetria asked. "No." She raised an eyebrow. "Friends?" Owen hesitated for a moment. Then he answered, "Family." The word hung quietly in the kitchen. Demetria felt something shift inside her chest. Years ago, she had experienced one dinner with Owen's family. Just one. That had been enough. They hadn't been rude. No one raised their voice. No one said anything openly disrespectful. But their polite smiles had carried distance, the kind that made it clear she didn't belong in their world. Owen seemed to notice the change in her expression. "It's just dinner," he said. Demetria returned to slicing vegetables. "How many people?" 6 or 7. "That's manageable." Another short silence passed. Then Owen added something carefully. "I wouldn't ask if it made you uncomfortable." Demetria wiped her hands with a towel. She thought about the past for a moment. The subtle tension in that old dining room years ago. The careful questions about her background. The quiet way people had looked at her like she was an unexpected guest. Then she looked around the kitchen she now controlled. Her knives. Her ingredients. Her work. She had built her own life since then. And she wasn't the same woman she had been 7 years ago. Finally, she turned toward Owen. "I cook for people," she said calmly. He waited. Not their opinions. Owen studied her for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "That's fair." Demetria picked up the bowl of vegetables and placed it beside the stove. "What kind of dinner are you expecting?" Owen relaxed slightly. "Simple. Nothing too formal." "Formal people eat simple food too," she replied. "True." She began writing a few notes in her notebook. "Any allergies in your family?" "None that I know of." "Favorite dishes?" Owen thought for a moment. "My mother likes traditional meals." Demetria nodded while writing. Good ingredients usually satisfy traditional people. Owen smiled faintly. "You sound confident." "I am." Another pause followed. Then Owen asked quietly, "You sure this doesn't bother you?" Demetria closed the notebook. "I've cooked for people with worse attitudes than your relatives." That answer made him laugh. "I believe that." Demetria slid the chicken out of the oven and began plating dinner. The conversation moved back to normal topics again. Food, timing, weekend preparation. But after Owen left the kitchen with his plate, Demetria remained at the counter for a moment. Her thoughts drifted back to the last time she sat across from Owen's family, 7 years earlier. Back then she had cared what they thought. Back then she had wanted their approval. Now things were different. She didn't need anyone's approval to do her job. Still, life had a strange way of creating situations no one expected. Across the city that same evening, Chiara sat at the small table in Demetria's apartment coloring a picture with bright crayons. "Mama," she asked while drawing carefully, "you cook tomorrow again?" Demetria glanced over. "Yes, baby." Chiara held up the paper proudly. "Look." A stick figure stood beside a tall house. Demetria smiled. "That's beautiful." Chiara nodded seriously. "That's you, cooking." Demetria laughed softly. She didn't know it yet, but in just a few days, the small world inside her apartment and the quiet world inside Owen's mansion were about to meet face to face. And when that moment arrived, nothing about this job would stay simple anymore. Saturday arrived with a quiet sense of anticipation. Demetria pulled into Owen's driveway earlier than usual that morning. Dinner for guests required more preparation than a normal evening meal, and she preferred having extra time rather than rushing. She carried several grocery bags through the front door and headed straight for the kitchen. The moment she stepped inside, she began working. Chicken marinated with herbs and garlic, fresh vegetables washed and sliced, potatoes peeled and set aside for roasting. The kitchen moved with steady purpose as the morning passed. Demetria worked with calm focus, the same way she approached every serious dinner. Cooking was one of the few places in life where everything followed clear rules. Ingredients had order, timing mattered, heat transformed simple food into something memorable. Relationships rarely followed rules like that. Around midday, Owen stepped into the kitchen. He had changed into a simple dark shirt and looked slightly more tense than usual. "Morning," he said. Demetria glanced up briefly. "Morning." He leaned against the counter, watching her slice fresh herbs. "You started early. Dinner for guests isn't something you rush." Owen nodded. "That makes sense." He stayed there for a moment longer. Normally he kept his distance while she worked. Today felt different. Finally, Demetria noticed. "You nervous?" she asked. Owen looked mildly surprised. "Is it that obvious?" "Yes." He exhaled quietly. Family gatherings can be complicated. Demetria understood that without needing more explanation. 7 years earlier, she had experienced a version of that tension herself. She placed chopped herbs into a bowl. "Well," she said calmly, "good food usually helps people relax. I'm counting on that." The afternoon passed quickly. The kitchen filled with rich smells as ingredients moved from preparation to cooking. Butter melted slowly in a pan. Chicken roasted inside the oven. Vegetables caramelized with honey and olive oil. Demetria moved through the kitchen with quiet confidence. Meanwhile, Owen walked through the house making small adjustments. Lighting in the dining room, extra chairs near the table, wine glasses arranged neatly beside each plate. The mansion felt more alive than usual. Even the quiet rooms seemed to carry a sense of expectation. By early evening, the table was set. Candles waited near the center. Plates arranged carefully. The aroma of dinner filled the house. Demetria checked the oven once more before wiping her hands on a towel. Everything was ready, right on schedule. Owen stepped into the kitchen again, just as she finished plating the first appetizers. "They'll be here soon," he said. Demetria nodded. Good timing. The doorbell rang a few minutes later. Owen walked toward the front door. Demetria stayed in the kitchen preparing the next dish. Voices soon entered the house. Polite greetings, footsteps crossing the hallway. The quiet rhythm of guests settling into conversation. Demetria carried a tray of appetizers toward the dining room. She stepped into the doorway just long enough to place the food on the table. Owen stood near the head of the table, speaking with his family. For a moment their eyes met across the room. Neither said anything. Then Demetria returned to the kitchen. The dinner continued smoothly. Courses moved from the kitchen to the table with careful timing. Conversation from the dining room drifted through the hallway. Business stories, travel memories, laughter that sounded polite rather than loud. Very different from the kind of dinners Demetria grew up with. Back in her childhood home, people talked over each other constantly. Here, everyone waited their turn. Different worlds, different rhythms. Demetria began preparing the final dish when something unexpected happened. The front door opened again. She froze for a moment, listening. A small voice echoed through the hallway. "Mama!" Demetria's heart stopped, because she recognized that voice instantly. Kiara. And suddenly, the evening everyone thought they understood was about to change completely. The small voice echoed through the hallway again. "Mama!" Demetria's hand froze on the kitchen counter. For a split second, her mind refused to process what she had just heard. But the sound came again. "Mama!" This time it was closer. Faster. Her heart dropped into her stomach. "Kiara." Demetria stepped out of the kitchen just as a tiny figure rushed down the hallway. Kiara's curly hair bounced wildly as she ran straight toward her. "Mama, I found you." Demetria quickly knelt down and caught her in a hug. "Baby, slow down." Kiara wrapped her arms around Demetria's neck like she had just completed an important mission. "I was looking everywhere." Demetria held her daughter tightly for a second while her mind raced. The neighbor who usually watched Kiara on weekends must have brought her here when the daycare closed early. Kiara clearly thought she was simply visiting her mother at work, and under normal circumstances, that would have been fine. But nothing about this situation was normal, because behind them the dining room had gone completely silent. The conversation stopped. The clinking of glasses stopped. Even the quiet background music seemed to fade under the weight of the moment. Demetria slowly stood up while holding Kiara's hand, and when she turned around, she saw why the entire room had frozen. Owen was staring at them, not just casually looking, staring. His eyes had locked onto Kiara's face with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. For a moment he didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply looked. Kiara blinked back at him curiously. Children rarely notice the tension adults carry in moments like this. She tilted her head slightly. "Who that?" she asked softly. Demetria swallowed. The entire room waited. Owen took a slow step forward, then another. His attention never left Kiara's face. "How old is she?" he asked quietly. The question landed softly in the room, but it carried enormous weight. Demetria felt every pair of eyes in the dining room shift toward her. She answered calmly. 3. The number hung in the air. 3 years. Owen did the math instantly. The timeline moved through his mind faster than words could follow. 7 years since they last saw each other. 3 years since this child was born. His gaze returned to Kiara's face, and the resemblance suddenly became impossible to ignore. The shape of her eyes, the color, the quiet way she studied people before speaking. Pieces of himself reflected back in a child he had never seen before. The realization hit him without warning, like a door inside his mind swinging open all at once. Kiara squeezed Demetria's hand. "Mama, why everybody quiet?" Demetria gently squeezed her daughter's hand back. "It's okay, baby." Owen stopped a few feet away from them. His voice sounded different now. Quieter, careful. "What's her name?" Demetria met his eyes. "Kiara." Owen repeated the name slowly. "Kiara." The word felt unfamiliar and strangely personal at the same time. Kiara looked at him again. "You tall," she said matter-of-factly. A faint sound of nervous laughter escaped from someone sitting at the table, but Owen barely noticed. His focus remained entirely on the child standing in front of him. Kiara stepped slightly closer to Demetria. "Mama," she whispered. "That man looking at me." Demetria knelt beside her. "He's just curious." Owen lowered himself slowly to one knee so he was closer to Kiara's height. The movement surprised everyone in the room. His voice softened when he spoke again. "Hi, Kiara." Kiara stared at him seriously for a moment. Then she waved. "Hi." Another long silence filled the room. Then Kiara said something that made the moment even heavier. "You look like me." The honesty of children often lands harder than any adult conversation. Owen felt the words settle deep in his chest. Because she was right. The resemblance was undeniable now. He looked up at Demetria. For the first time since seeing the child, real emotion crossed his face. Confusion. Shock. A quiet kind of pain. "Demetria," he said slowly. She didn't try to avoid the moment. She didn't pretend the truth was anything else. Instead, she nodded once. Yes. The word didn't need explanation. The entire room understood. Owen stayed kneeling there for a moment longer, staring at Kiara as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. 3 years of life had passed without him knowing she existed. 3 years of birthdays. 3 years of first words. 3 years of laughter he had never heard. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Kiara tugged gently on Demetria's sleeve. "Mama, I hungry." Demetria stood up slowly. "Of course you are." She lifted Kiara into her arms. As she turned toward the kitchen, Owen remained kneeling in the same spot, trying to process the truth that had just walked into his life without warning. A daughter, a child he never knew existed, and suddenly nothing about this dinner, or this job, felt simple anymore. Demetria carried Kiara back into the kitchen while the dining room behind them remained completely still. The moment had frozen everyone at the table, but Demetria couldn't worry about that right now. Her daughter came first. She placed Kiara gently on the counter and grabbed a small plate from the cabinet. "Let's get you something to eat," she said softly. Kiara swung her legs happily while looking around the kitchen. "This big house," she said. "Yes, it is bigger than our house." Demetria smiled faintly. "Much bigger." She sliced a piece of warm bread and added a little butter before handing the plate to Kiara. The little girl immediately began nibbling while humming quietly to herself. Children had a way of adjusting to new environments much faster than adults. Kiara seemed completely comfortable. Meanwhile, Demetria felt the tension from the dining room pressing against the kitchen walls. She knew Owen would come looking for answers, and she knew that conversation had been waiting to happen for 3 years. Footsteps approached down the hallway. Owen stepped into the kitchen slowly. For a moment he didn't speak. His attention went straight to Kiara. She noticed him and waved with a mouth full of bread. "Hi again." Owen forced a small smile. "Hi." He looked back at Demetria. The calm expression he usually carried had disappeared. Now his face showed something much more complicated. Confusion, regret, and a quiet pain he wasn't trying to hide. "You should have told me," he said. His voice stayed low, but the weight behind the words filled the room. Demetria crossed her arms slowly. "I thought about it." "How long?" "Months." Owen ran a hand across his forehead. "And every time you decided not to?" Demetria held his gaze. "Yes." "Why?" The question came out heavier now, not angry, just wounded. Demetria took a breath before answering. "You left." Owen's shoulders stiffened. "I asked for space. You disappeared," she replied calmly. The silence stretched between them again. Owen looked toward Kiara, who was now focused entirely on buttering another piece of bread. Then he looked back at Demetria. "I didn't leave because I stopped caring. That's not how it felt. I was drowning in work," Owen said quietly. "Investors, expansion, pressure. Everything was falling apart." Demetria listened without interrupting, but her expression remained steady. "And you thought the solution was to vanish from my life?" Owen exhaled slowly. "I thought I was protecting what we had. You erased it." The words landed softly but firmly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Kiara suddenly looked up from her plate. "Why y'all talking serious?" Both adults softened instantly. Demetria gently touched her daughter's hair. "We're just talking, baby." Kiara studied Owen again. "You sad?" Owen hesitated. Then he answered honestly. "A little." Kiara tilted her head thoughtfully. "You want bread?" She held out a piece toward him. The simple gesture caught Owen completely off guard. He accepted the piece slowly. "Thank you." "You, welcome." Kiara returned to eating like the problem had been solved. For a moment the tension in the kitchen eased, but the conversation between the adults still needed to continue. Owen set the bread on the counter and looked back at Demetria. "I missed 3 years." His voice was quieter now. Demetria nodded. "Yes." 3 birthdays. "Yes." 3 years of her life. Demetria didn't respond. She simply watched him absorb the reality. Owen leaned against the counter slowly. "I would have been there," he said. "I didn't know that. You could have asked." Demetria shook her head slightly. "I wasn't going to chase someone who already walked away." The sentence hung between them. Not cruel, just honest. Owen looked down at the floor for a moment before speaking again. "I didn't walk away from a child. You walked away from me." Another silence followed, this one heavier. Kiara suddenly reached toward Owen again. "You still sad?" He looked at her. "Yes." Kiara considered that carefully. Then she said something that made both adults pause. "My mama make people happy with food." Demetria laughed softly. She tries. Kiara nodded confidently. Food fix it. Owen couldn't help smiling at that. Maybe it does. He knelt down again so he was at Kiara's level. Hi again, Kiara. She waved once more. Hi. What are you eating? Bread. Looks good. It is. Owen glanced up briefly at Demetria, then back at Kiara. Do you like visiting your mama at work? Kiara nodded enthusiastically. Yes. Demetria watched the interaction quietly. This was the moment she had imagined so many times. The first time Owen spoke to his daughter, the first time he truly saw her, and despite everything that had happened between them, something inside Demetria softened, because the look on Owen's face right now wasn't confusion anymore. It was something else. Recognition, responsibility, a quiet realization settling into place. Kiara finished her bread and smiled proudly. Good. Owen nodded. Yes, it is. The kitchen fell quiet again. But this silence felt different from the one earlier in the dining room. This one carried the beginning of something new, because the truth had finally been spoken. And once truth enters a room, nothing ever goes back to the way it was before. The first few days after the dinner were strangely quiet, not awkward, just thoughtful, like everyone involved needed a little time to adjust to the new reality. Owen didn't try to rush anything. He understood that stepping into a child's life after 3 years wasn't something that could happen overnight. So he started small. The first visit happened a few afternoons later. Demetria arrived at the mansion kitchen with Kiara holding her hand. Kiara looked around the large house with open curiosity. This big, she said. Owen crouched slightly to meet her eye level. Yes, it is. Kiara nodded seriously. You live here? I do. She thought about that for a moment. Then she asked the question that children ask without hesitation. You my friend? Owen smiled. I hope so. Kiara seemed satisfied with that answer. Okay. Demetria watched the interaction from the kitchen doorway. Part of her still carried caution. Owen was stepping into unknown territory. Fatherhood wasn't something you could schedule like a meeting or analyze like a business plan, but Owen seemed determined to learn. One afternoon, he sat on the floor beside Kiara with a small pile of wooden blocks. She was building a tower with intense concentration. Owen attempted to help. Within seconds, the tower collapsed. Kiara burst into laughter. You not good builder. Owen chuckled. I'm starting to notice that. She handed him another block. Try again. The second tower lasted slightly longer. Still crooked. Still unstable. But Kiara clapped proudly. Better. Owen realized something important during moments like that. Children didn't care about perfection. They cared about presence. Just being there mattered more than doing everything right. Another evening he tried reading Kiara a bedtime story while Demetria prepared dinner in the kitchen. Halfway through the book he stumbled over a word. Kiara corrected him immediately. No, that's say dinosaur. Owen looked at the page again. You're right. Kiara nodded with the confidence of someone who had clearly mastered the situation. Keep reading. Demetria leaned quietly against the kitchen doorway, watching them. The sight stirred emotions she hadn't expected. Owen wasn't pretending. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply trying. And effort carried its own kind of sincerity. A week later, Kiara arrived at the house with a drawing folded in her small hand. She ran straight toward Owen. I make picture. Owen knelt down. Can I see? Kiara unfolded the paper proudly. The drawing showed 3 stick figures standing beside a house. Demetria, Kiara, and a very tall figure she had colored blue. Owen studied it carefully. That's us. Kiara nodded. Yes. He felt something shift quietly inside his chest. A child he had just met had already placed him inside her small understanding of family. He looked up at Demetria. She stood across the room watching them quietly, not interfering, not pushing, just observing. Trust didn't rebuild instantly, but slowly, piece by piece. It began forming again, because Owen kept showing up, day after day, learning patience, learning how to listen, learning that fatherhood wasn't about grand gestures. It was about moments, small ones, like building crooked block towers, or finishing bedtime stories, or simply sitting beside a little girl who was slowly learning that this man wasn't a stranger anymore. He was someone important, even if none of them fully understood yet what that future would look like. Weeks passed after the night Owen learned the truth. Life didn't suddenly become simple, but it began to settle into a rhythm. Owen visited often, usually in the afternoons after work. Sometimes Demetria brought Kiara to the mansion while she cooked dinner. Other times Owen stopped by the apartment to spend time with his daughter before bedtime. At first the visits felt careful, measured. Demetria watched closely, not interfering but not ignoring anything either. Trust, once broken, didn't return because someone asked for it. It returned slowly through consistency, and Owen understood that. One Sunday evening, Demetria invited him to dinner. The setting wasn't a mansion. It was her apartment, the same small place where Kiara-colored pictures on the living room floor and cartoons played quietly in the background. Owen arrived carrying nothing except a slightly nervous expression. Kiara opened the door for him with excitement. "You here?" "I am," Owen said. She grabbed his hand immediately and pulled him inside. "Come see my toys." Owen laughed softly as she led him across the room. Demetria watched from the kitchen while stirring a pot on the stove. The apartment smelled like slow-cooked food and warm spices. Comforting, real. Very different from the quiet elegance of Owen's house. Dinner didn't start with formal conversation. Kiara filled most of the space with stories about drawings, cartoons, and the impressive height of her latest block tower. Owen listened carefully to every word. Eventually, Kiara finished eating and wandered toward the living room to continue her coloring. That left Demetria and Owen sitting across from each other at the small table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Owen leaned back slightly. "This place feels alive." Demetria smiled faintly. "It usually is." He looked toward the living room where Kiara hummed quietly to herself. "I understand now why you built your life this way." Demetria folded her hands together. "You mean, without you?" Owen didn't flinch. "Yes." The honesty in the answer hung between them. "I made that choice because I thought it was the only one I had," she said. "I know." Owen rested his elbows on the table. "And I'm not asking you to pretend those years didn't happen." Demetria studied his face. "What are you asking?" "Time." She didn't respond immediately, because time was exactly what had been missing before. Eventually she stood up and walked toward the small balcony door. The night air outside carried the quiet sounds of the city. Cars moving in the distance, music drifting faintly from somewhere nearby. Owen joined her on the balcony a moment later. The two of them leaned against the railings side by side. Atlanta's skyline glowed softly in the distance. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Owen finally said what had been sitting quietly in his mind for weeks. "I never stopped thinking about you." Demetria looked at him carefully. "That's a heavy sentence." "It's also true." She crossed her arms gently. "You broke my heart." "I know. You disappeared when things got hard." "Yes." Owen didn't try to soften the truth. He simply acknowledged it. Then he added something quieter. "I should have fought harder for us." The honesty in his voice carried more weight than any dramatic speech. Demetria looked back toward the apartment where Kiara sat drawing pictures on the floor. "That little girl changed my life," she said softly. "I can see that, and I won't let anything hurt her." Owen nodded immediately. "You shouldn't." The night air moved gently around them. Finally, Demetria looked at him again. "You don't rebuild trust with words." "I know. You rebuild it with time." Owen gave a small nod. "Then I guess I better start using mine wisely." For the first time in a long while, Demetria allowed herself to smile without hesitation. Not because everything had been fixed, but because for the first time since the past broke apart, the future didn't feel impossible anymore. Months passed quietly after that night on the balcony. Life didn't transform overnight. Instead, it changed the way most real things do. Slowly, piece by piece. Owen became part of the everyday rhythm that already existed between Demetria and Kiara. He didn't try to force his way into their lives. He simply showed up. Again and again. Some evenings he arrived just before dinner, sitting at the kitchen counter while Demetria cooked. Other days he spent an hour on the floor with Kiara building crooked block towers that never quite stayed upright. He learned quickly that 3-year-olds had very strong opinions about how towers should look. "You doing it wrong," Kiara told him one afternoon. Owen studied the blocks in front of him. "Again?" "Yes." She handed him another piece. "Try better." Demetria laughed from the stove. "He's learning." Owen smiled. Slowly, the mansion kitchen changed during those months too. What once felt like an empty room now carried the familiar sounds of life. Cabinet doors opening, pans warming on the stove, Kiara dragging a chair across the floor so she could reach the counter. Helping, in her world, still meant stirring things that didn't require stirring. One evening, the three of them stood in the kitchen together while dinner cooked. Garlic and herbs filled the room. Kiara leaned over the counter watching Demetria chop vegetables. Then she turned toward Owen. "Come here." Owen walked over. "Yes?" Kiara held up a spoon. "You stir?" He accepted the spoon seriously. "Yes, chef." Kiara nodded approvingly. Demetria glanced between them and shook her head with a smile. "You two are going to ruin my kitchen." "No, we not," Kiara said confidently. "We helping." Dinner finished cooking a few minutes later. They sat together at the small dining table near the window. Outside, the city lights stretched across the horizon. For a while, the only sound was forks touching plates. Then Kiara looked up suddenly. "Daddy." The word slipped out naturally, like it had always belonged there. Owen froze for a moment. Not because the word felt wrong, but because it felt unexpectedly right. He looked at Kiara. "You said Daddy." Kiara nodded casually while eating her vegetables. "Yes." Demetria watched the moment quietly from across the table. Owen's expression softened in a way she hadn't seen before. Not surprise, something deeper. Belonging. Later that evening, Kiara wandered into the living room to finish a drawing. The kitchen grew quiet again. Owen stood near the counter while Demetria washed dishes. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "I love you." Demetria didn't turn immediately. She placed the last plate into the rack and dried her hands with a towel. Then she faced him. Her expression wasn't shocked or uncertain, just thoughtful. "Love was never the problem," she said softly. Owen waited. Demetria stepped closer. "You prove love with what you do every day." Owen nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I plan to do." From the living room, Kiara suddenly ran back into the kitchen holding her drawing. "Look." She spread the paper across the table. 3 stick figures stood beside a house. One tall, one medium, one small. Demetria leaned over. "That's beautiful." Kiara pointed proudly. "That's Mama." Then she pointed to the tallest figure. "That's Daddy." Finally, she tapped the smallest drawing in the middle. "That's me." Owen smiled. Kiara studied both of them carefully. Then she said the simplest truth in the entire room. "We family." Sometimes the most important things in life aren't complicated. They don't arrive with dramatic speeches or perfect timing. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in a kitchen filled with food, in the laughter of a child, in the steady promise of someone choosing to stay. And in that moment, standing together beside a small table and a crayon drawing, Demetria realized something she never expected to feel again. Hope. Because second chances don't erase the past. They build something better on top of it. Before you leave, drop a comment and tell me this. Was Demetria right to keep Kiara a secret? Or should Owen have known from the beginning? Your answers might surprise you. If this story made you feel something, hit the like button and share it with someone who believes family isn't always perfect, but it's always worth fighting for. And make sure you subscribe to Mr. Graham Family, because the next story might just change the way you see love.